Welcome to episode 2 of our series on business cycles. In episode 1, we defined the static norm of the circular flow. Today, we confront the structural realities, friction and monopoly, that make that norm impossible to achieve.
Indeed. And it's a really important step to take. Last time, we were assuming in this beautiful, almost pristine, logical world built by Leon Walras.
The general equilibrium.
Exactly. It's the analytical ideal. It's this logical norm where, because you have perfect information, everything adjusts instantly, every single market clears at the same time, the economy just settles into this graceful mathematical balance.
A perfectly still pond.
Yeah.
That's the image we used. And our mission today really is to pick up a big rock and toss it right into the middle of that pond. We're going to crack it open. We're diving deep into chapter 2 of our analysis, and we're focusing squarely on the flaws, the inevitable structural complexities of the real world.
Right. The things that guarantee that perfect static model fails. We have to introduce constraints, and these constraints aren't just minor details. They're fundamental. They represent the messy, mechanical, and frankly, the human elements.
Things like time.
Time, uncertainty, strategic behavior, all these things that, far from guiding the system towards that elegant, determinate solution, they actually introduce instability. They actively destroy the perfect symmetry that Walras worked so hard to engineer.
Okay, so let's lay out the roadmap for today. We're tackling 3 core structural realities, these hard limits on the ideal model. First, we need to look at how the price mechanism, even in its perfect theoretical form, is supposed to handle the huge issue of distribution.
How income gets divided up.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Then, second, we're going to confront the disruptive role of friction and time lags. The simple fact that nothing, absolutely nothing, happens instantly.
And third, we'll get into the immense impact of imperfect competition. We have to deal with the messy reality of monopoly, of oligopoly, the world we actually live in.
And once we've broken down the model with those real-world problems, we're going to wrap up by looking at the methodology itself. There's a really sharp critique we need to unpack about overly simple macroeconomic models.
What's often called the aggregative fallacy. And this part is so important. It's an intellectual defense, really. It explains why we can't just skip ahead and use broad aggregates. It's why this rigorous micro-level work we're doing right now is absolutely necessary, even if our final goal is understanding the big picture of business cycles.
The very rigor of the discipline is on the line.
It truly is.
All right, let's start where Walras started, back inside that perfect theoretical machine. We know the general equilibrium system is famous for solving supply and demand across all markets at once. But when we look at Chapter 2D specifically, what is the full job description of the price system here? It's doing more than just clearing the market for, say, bread, right?
Oh, much, much more. In the pure static model, you should think of the price system as the universal allocator. It's the grand integrator. It is performing this task of immense mathematical complexity.
And it has to do it all at once.
Instantaneously and simultaneously. It's setting the relative prices for every single consumer good, every service, and, this is the crucial part for distribution, every single productive factor.
So, labor, land, and capital.
Precisely. And it expresses all these values in terms of a single standardized unit. It's what economists call the numeraire.
The numeraire. Now, that sounds a bit more complicated than just a yardstick or a unit of measurement.
Right.
Why is that concept so essential for the whole system to work mathematically?
It's the absolute bedrock of consistency. I mean, just imagine trying to solve a system of, say, 1 million simultaneous equations where all your variables are in different, totally incomparable units.
Kilos of steel, hours of labor, square meters of office space.
You can't do it. It's mathematical chaos. The numeraire acts as the universal common denominator. It is the unit of account, the standard against which the value of everything else in the economy is expressed. Without that singular standard, the mathematical determinacy of the whole general equilibrium solution it collapses instantly.
And this framework, this whole idea, it didn't just appear out of nowhere. You can trace its roots back.
Oh, absolutely. The foundations are clearly there in Adam Smith's work. Smith had this rudimentary theory of equilibrium that pointed directly toward this general framework. He understood intuitively that for the economy to be in balance, you couldn't just price the final products, the widgets. The system had to price everything, all the inputs and all the outputs at the same time.
Walras just provided the math.
He formalized it with a level of mathematical rigor that was completely unprecedented. He turned Smith's philosophical insight into a solvable determinate system of equations.
Okay, so once you have this all-powerful price system working, pricing every single input and output, it then almost magically resolves what classical economists saw as one of the biggest societal puzzles,
The problem of economic distribution.
which leads us directly to the famed triad of income.
That's the logical endpoint of the model. And you have to see that within this static framework, distribution isn't a policy question. It's not about fairness or politics. It's an analytical inevitability that is linked directly and solely to the pricing of productive services.
So the model sorts everyone into their boxes.
It does. The Walrasian system structures all economic actors into three functional classes. You have the landowners, the workers, and the capitalists. And these classes, logically, are the only suppliers of the three corresponding productive services.
Land, labor, and capital.
Right. And so their income streams are, respectively, rents for the landowners, wages for the workers, and profit, which is defined here very strictly as the return on capital for the capitalists.
But this is where we get to that fascinating and really radical simplification that we touched on earlier, the role of the entrepreneur or the firm. It's very strange in this model.
It's a critical point, and it's one that often confuses people who are used to thinking about the modern economy. Walras reduces the entrepreneur to a purely formal role. Think of the firm not as a dynamic, risk-taking, innovative enterprise.
Like we do today.
Right. Instead, think of it as just an instantaneous conduit, a black box. Its function is rigidly defined. It buys productive services from households, and it instantly sells consumer goods back to them. That's it.
So in this perfect static world, the firm itself earns zero profit. Is that right?
Exactly. In a perfect static equilibrium, long-run economic profit has to be zero. I mean, think about it. If there were any positive profit to be made, it would immediately incentivize new firms to enter the market.
And that new competition would drive prices down until the profit disappeared.
Until it normalized back to zero. So in the Walrasian world, the firm cannot be an independent agent that earns its own income. All the income that's generated is immediately and completely channeled back to the factors of production that were supplied by the households.
So the households are the real decision makers.
They are the sole recipients of rents, wages, and the return on capital. The entrepreneur, the very figure we celebrate today as the engine of growth and innovation, is analytically just a non-income earning shell.
That has some pretty profound implications, doesn't it? If the entrepreneur is just a passive channel, Walras has essentially eliminated two of the most important concepts for understanding a dynamic economy.
Uncertainty and innovation. He's assumed them away.
Why? To maintain the math.
To maintain the mathematical determinacy. That is the analytical price you pay for static perfection. By assuming away risk and making the firm passive, Walras guarantees that once the price system has determined the scarcity and the cost of the three-factor services, the problem of distribution is solved automatically.
That's tautological.
It is. It's internally consistent, a beautiful logical loop, but it's completely stripped of all entrepreneurial dynamism.
And this is a huge departure from earlier views. I'm thinking of Smith's initial theory of value, which kind of suggested that labor produced everything and that rent and profit were just deductions skimmed off the top by other classes.
The general equilibrium view just completely throws that framework out. There's no concept of a deduction. Instead, what you have is the simultaneous pricing of all necessary and scarce factors. Since scarcity and utility are valued by the system, distribution simply reflects those determined prices. Each factor gets what it contributes as valued by the equilibrium price. No more, no less.
Let's zoom in a little bit more on capital within this system, especially the rate of interest. How does Walras make sure that the interest rate acts as this ultimate binding agent that holds all the different markets together?
The rate of interest is interpreted purely as the price paid for the productive services of capital goods. That could be a new machine being built today or an existing factory that's already in use. And the mechanism he uses is, well, it's ingenious in its consistency.
How does it work?
First, the supply and demand for future goods determine the price of new capital goods. From that price, you can then derive what's called the net perpetual rate of return.
The interest rate.
The interest rate. And then this rate is applied universally.
And when you say universally, you're not just talking about bank loans.
No, its influence extends everywhere. This single universal interest rate gets applied to every single income-producing asset in the economy. Existing capital, new capital, even land. This one rate enters all the supply and demand equations across the entire economy. It's the glue.
So it's what creates that comprehensive internal system where every single price, the wage rate, the rent on land, the value of a factory, and the price of a loaf of bread is all fully interdependent and consistent with everything else.
Yes, the perfect solution, the entire clockwork universe, relies completely on the universal application of this one rate, a rate that itself is derived from the equilibrium between saving and investment.
Okay, so that is the ideal. A perfect, frictionless clockwork universe. Now, let's break it. All right, we have this beautifully designed, perfectly consistent theoretical machine, but its core requirement is instant, simultaneous adjustment. So now let's introduce the messy reality of the physical world. Let's introduce what economists call friction. What exactly do we mean by friction in this context?
Well, friction, in an economic sense, refers to any cost or any impediment that prevents the economy from moving instantly and smoothly towards that theoretical equilibrium. And in a real market, this isn't just about prices being a little sticky.
It's more than that.
It's much more. It includes very tangible costs. Think about the expense of just researching new suppliers. Those are search costs. Or the legal fees and the time involved in changing a transaction costs. The immense time and money it takes for specialized labor to move to a new city or to retrain for a new industry.
Mobility costs.
Right. And of course, the costs associated with sunk investments. You've already built the factory. You can't just move it. All of these are frictions.
This is where that analogy to physics becomes so useful.
It's a direct parallel. I mean, theoretical physics operates with these highly idealized, completely unrealistic models. You have motion without air resistance, pulleys that have no mass, elastic cords that respond instantly with no energy loss.
The Walrasian system is the economic version of that.
Exactly. It explicitly abstracts away from friction, and most importantly for our deep dive on business cycles, it abstracts away from the passage of time.
And Walras was completely open about this, wasn't he? He knew this was a fundamental abstraction.
Oh, yes. The source is very clear on this. It says Walras purement et simplement descuidó. He purely and simply neglected time delays in his initial pure theory of production. He treated all markets as if they operated in a single timeless instant.
But that's the core problem, isn't it? Production, by its very nature, requires time. There's always a lag, an irreducible lag between the decision to produce something and that thing actually being available on the market.
And that time lag just shatters the whole concept of a static equilibrium. It creates this immediate and catastrophic disconnect with reality.
Oh, so?
Well, for the system to reach and then maintain a static equilibrium, all the production decisions have to be carried out over a period during which the underlying conditions remain absolutely rigid. The source says nothing must be allowed to change.
Give us an example.
Okay, let's say it takes 3 years to build a new power plant. For the initial decision to be correct in the Walrasian sense, the labor costs, the price of steel, the interest rate, and the final expected price of the electricity sold, all of those things must remain static for the entire 3 years.
A condition that is, to put it mildly, spectacularly unrealistic.
It's impossible in a dynamic world. The moment anything changes, the original calculation is wrong, and the equilibrium path is broken.
So, if the model is perfect and has no friction, how does it theoretically even get to that equilibrium point in the first place? This brings us to that famous idea of the tautonement.
The trial and error process, yes. The idea is that there's a sort of fictional auctioneer calling out prices.
And everyone responds to those price signals.
That's right. Tautonim posits that actors respond to these signals. If there's excess supply, the price is lowered. If there's excess demand, the price is raised. And through this groping trial and error process, the system eventually converges on the one true set of market clearing prices.
But the moment we introduce real-world friction and time, that entire mechanism fails. What's the specific critique of tautonim when you try to apply it to production?
The critique is just devastating. Because for Toldon to work in the real world, it assumes two highly questionable things. First, it assumes that production plans can be readjusted instantaneously. And second, it assumes that reactions happen only through price changes, not through, say, quantity adjustments or other signals.
The model assumes that price changes will probably lead toward equilibrium.
Yes, but that probably is doing a lot of work. That probability depends entirely on instant and zero-cost compliance from everyone in the system. And that's where the key difference lies, the type of economic decision being adjusted.
What do you mean?
Think about something simple, like retail. If the price of apples at the grocery store is too high today, you just buy fewer apples. That's an instantaneous, almost completely frictionless decision. But when Walras applies the same Tatonement logic to production, he is implicitly assuming that these huge, tentative decisions to produce decisions that are embodied in long-term bonds, in contracts for raw materials, in commitments to specialized labor, that these things can be readjusted just as instantly.
Which they obviously can't. You can't unsign a 3-year lease on a factory. You can't instantly untrain a specialized engineer.
Precisely. The source really stresses this point, saying that readjusting these production commitments is a matter of much more difficulty than simply reorganizing decisions about buying or selling finished goods. These rigidities, these are forms of sunk costs and contractual inertia.
So the system gets stuck.
It either gets stuck or it overshoots. If you've invested millions in specialized capital based on an expected price, you can't just scrap that plan because the market price twitched a little bit today. The rigidity of production plans breaks the instantaneous adjustment mechanism that Tatonement requires.
And this inherent structural problem of friction, it gets even worse. It gets magnified when we stop talking about an abstract numeraire economy and introduce a real monetary system.
Oh, exponentially worse. In a real-world monetary economy, friction becomes volatile and it can become systemic. And that's because money is uniquely liquid. It is so easily and instantly redirected in response to, sentiment, fear, or tiny signals in the market.
This mobility amplifies uncertainty.
Tremendously. And Walras himself, for all his focus on the static ideal, he recognized this. He recognized the inherent instability of bank credit. The source quotes him referring to the inestabilidad del crédito bancario.
So money, which we think of as the lubricant of the real economy, also becomes a major source of friction and instability because it's so volatile.
It is. It introduces opportunities for stagnation and these profound uncertainties. These are terms that are completely absent in the abstract numeric economy, where credit just doesn't exist outside of the final equilibrium. The practical value, the predictive power of that elegant Walrasian result is just significantly reduced when you factor in these real and monetary frictions. It proves static ideal is simply unattainable.
Okay, so friction and time prevent us from even reaching the static norm. Now let's look at the very structure of the economy itself. The static norm, it requires pure, perfect competition. This theoretical world where every firm is just a passive price taker. What happens when we admit that real markets are dominated by strategic actors who actually have market power?
Well, this is where the market structure just breaks the math entirely. The really rigorous models, they give us two theoretical fundamental or limiting cases that allow for a clean, calculable answer.
Pure competition on one end.
Where you have an infinite number of infinitesimal actors, and pure monopoly on the other, where one actor controls everything. In those two extreme cases, you can get mathematical closure. You can solve the equations.
But economic reality, and certainly economic history, shows us that the market is completely dominated by the things in the middle, the hybrids.
Exactly. The vast majority of real-world markets are filled with these hybrids. This includes structures where you have many firms, but they all differentiate their products. That's monopolistic competition. Think restaurants or clothing brands. Or where you have just a few very large firms that dominate an industry that's oligopoly, like the major airlines or car manufacturers.
And the strategic game they have to play just defies the simple math of the general equilibrium.
It does. And we should probably pause here to remember Adam Smith's early take on monopoly pricing, which the source suggests was a little bit naive.
Right, his idea that the monopoly price is always the highest that can be obtained.
The source rightly calls this a senseless or even false phrase. And it's worth asking why. Why is it senseless? Because a monopolist, just like any rational business, is trying to maximize profit, not price.
If they charge the absolute highest possible price, they might sell 0 units.
They might. The optimal monopoly price involves a calculation of marginal revenue and marginal cost. It often results in a price that's lower than the absolute maximum you could possibly charge, but it's still significantly higher than the price you'd get under perfect competition. It requires strategic thinking, not just a simple reaction.
So how exactly does this reality of imperfect competition undermine the mathematical determinacy that the Walrasian model absolutely depends on?
It all comes down to a simple rule. In a world of pure competition, the firm's optimal behavior is dictated by a rigid, simple formula. To maximize profit in the long run, price must equal marginal cost. P equals MC. If that rule holds for every firm, the entire system of equations clears, and a unique solution exists. Determinacy is guaranteed.
But having market power fundamentally changes the firm's relationship with the price.
It changes everything. If a firm operates in any environment where it faces a downward-sloping demand curve, which is true for monopoly, oligopoly, and a monopolistic competition, that ideal mathematical outcome just vanishes. The firm is no longer a passive price taker.
Its best outcome isn't determined by the market anymore.
No, it has to find it. Instead of PMC, the firm now operates where marginal revenue equals marginal cost, MRMC. And because it has market power, the price it sets will be higher than its marginal cost. P is greater than MC.
This means the firm has to actively strategize. It's not just passively reacting anymore.
That's the key. The firm has to engage in all this complex, non-price competition, advertising, branding, creating product differentiation, maybe even planned obsolescence. Or in an oligopoly, it's engaging in these complex game theory scenarios against its rivals.
This is active strategic behavior. It's profoundly unpredictable from the perspective of a static model that just relies on simple supply and demand curves.
It is. And since the optimal price and output combination is no longer guaranteed by the market structure itself, the general equilibrium solution can't be reliably calculated. The whole system becomes indeterminate. The math breaks.
I think Marshall's perspective here is so insightful, this idea that these hybrid cases, they aren't the deviation from the norm. They are the norm.
That's a really crucial shift in methodological focus. Marshall, and then later economists like Chamberlain and Robinson, paid huge attention to how individual firms conquer what they called special markets. These aren't just niches, they are spheres of influence that a firm creates through its reputation, its location, its product quality.
And within that sphere, it has some pricing power.
It can maneuver. And Marshall preferred to see these hybrid cases, where success means you have to actively outperform your neighbor and capture your own differentiated market as the fundamental way business actually operates. In his view, pure competition is the strange mathematical aberration, not the standard we should judge everything against.
It really sounds like the birth of modern strategic business thinking, right inside economic theory.
It is. It shifts the whole focus from just optimizing your resources within given constraints to actively trying to change the constraints through strategic innovation. But the logical consequences of this market power are pretty clear, and they're generally negative for social welfare.
Because price is higher than marginal cost.
Right. It means that firms are not producing at the socially optimal level of output. And this brings us to the problem of excess capacity.
What's that?
The existence of market power generally leads to prices being higher and output being lower than the social optimum you'd get under pure competition. But beyond that, under monopolistic competition, all those efforts to differentiate products often lead to firms operating with excess capacity.
They aren't running at full steam.
Exactly. They aren't utilizing their factory or their restaurant to its full potential, because to do so, to produce more, they'd have to drop their price too drastically, and that would cut into their strategic profits. So that excess capacity is the visible social waste that's inherent in market power. It's a kind of waste that the ideal static model simply cannot see or account for.
So imperfect competition really delivers the final blow to the static ideal. Even if we had zero friction and no time lags, the strategic, non-deterministic nature of pricing means the Walrasian equations just can't be solved. The static norm remains structurally impossible to achieve.
Okay, so we have established the structural limitations. We've talked about the complexity of distribution, the drag of friction, and the way market power destroys determinacy. Now we need to shift gears and look at methodology. Having gone through all the details of this complex interdependent microeconomy, we now have to tackle a critique of model building itself.
Yes, specifically the tendency, which is particularly visible in certain macroeconomic schools of thought, to rely on overly simplified large-scale aggregate models. This is labeled the aggregative fallacy.
And this critique is so important for intellectual honesty. When economists, especially those who are, eager for immediate policy answers, which was often the case after the Great Depression, when they try to simplify the entire economy into just 3 or 4 big variables like total consumption, total investment, total output,
They miss the details.
they inevitably miss the underlying interdependent complexity we just spent all this time detailing. This move, this substitution of simple arithmetic for deep structural analysis, is a profound and dangerous intellectual shortcut.
Let's ground this critique in a concept that's often misunderstood.
Yeah.
Say's law. We need to be clear, we are defining it here not as some political statement, but as a core analytical principle about how markets are interdependent.
Precisely. The core analytical principle that you can derive from, say, and this holds true whether markets are working well or not, is that the concepts of demand and supply are only meaningful when you apply them to individual commodities or individual industries.
And how does the source define that specific relationship that proves this point?
The source clarifies this necessary condition for interdependence, stating that the demand components for the production of any industry or firm or individual comes from the supplies of all other industries or firms or individuals.
In other words, production is the source of purchasing power. My output is what allows me to demand your output.
Exactly. Demand and supply are inherently relative concepts. They're only defined in relation to one another inside the whole universe of commodities. This is what leads us to the analytical impossibility of talking about general overproduction or generalized aggregate supply and demand.
It becomes nonsensical.
Strictly speaking, it is nonsensical. Because demand is funded by supply, it's impossible to talk about general overproduction. You can absolutely have a situation where the supply in industry A is way too high compared to the demand coming from industries B and C. That's a mismatch, a disequilibrium.
But you can't have total supply exceeding total demand.
Not across the whole system. That would just be a meaningless accounting identity. This is where the analogy used in the analysis is so powerful, the one about the weight of the solar system.
Right. Explain that.
It likens talking about total demand to trying to calculate the weight of the solar system taken as a whole, or calculating the exchange value of every single sellable thing collectively. The analogy highlights that when you aggregate all goods and services, the resulting total, let's call it aggregate output or GDP, is a sum of fundamentally different things. It destroys the relational nature of the concepts.
Because supply and demand are only meaningful in relation to each other. The price of apples versus the price of oranges.
Yes. The moment you aggregate them all together, you destroy their analytical content.
So when we use these big aggregate terms like GDP or total demand, we have to be really careful to remember what they are. They're just summary statistics. They aren't behavioral variables that we can analyze on their own.
Exactly. They're often just accounting identities. You know, in macroeconomics, we state that saving must equal investment. But that identity tells you absolutely nothing about who is saving, who is investing, or why they're making those underlying decisions. The aggregative fallacy is trying to explain complex economic behavior by just manipulating these generalized totals, and in doing so, it completely ignores the underlying industrial processes that actually drive the instability.
And this brings us right to the critique of those superficial macro models, a critique often associated with the methodological rigor defended by thinkers like Schumpeter.
The aggregative approach is condemned precisely because it bypasses the necessary and frankly difficult analysis of the underlying industrial and microeconomic processes. If you only look at the aggregate totals, you completely miss the deep, complex mechanisms of general interdependence and how specific markets are clearing, or, more importantly, failing to clear. The crucial mechanisms of how a boom or a bust propagates through the system are hidden beneath the arithmetic.
And this leads to really serious errors when policies are made based on these misapplied concepts. Can you give us the main example of this error, of misapplying a micro proposition to a macro aggregate?
The classic example is the fallacy of composition. Let's say a single local industry, like shipbuilding in one town, faces a depression because of overproduction. That localized problem can often be cured by restricting that specific industry's output. That's a valid micro proposition.
Okay.
But the layman, or the superficial analyst who is only looking at aggregates, might then jump to the completely erroneous conclusion that a general economy-wide depression can be cured by a general output restriction across the entire economy.
But that doesn't work, because if everyone restricts their output, the total supply of purchasing power in the economy goes down proportionally.
Precisely. A general restriction just shrinks the whole pie. It shifts the problem without solving it and likely just leads to stagnation. This is the exact error. Taking a valid conclusion from a partial equilibrium analysis and wrongly applying it to the whole system without accounting for the underlying mechanism of interdependence, which dictates that demand is ultimately derived from supply.
So the aggregative fallacy is more than just a simplification. It's substituting surface-level arithmetic for deep structural analysis.
It results in superficial treatments that might offer politically convenient solutions, but they're analytically bankrupt. This defense of rigor, this insistence on it, is framed in our source as an inexorable necessity. It's a tradition that goes all the way back to Aristotle, where the driving force was always analytical intention.
The source really stresses this inexorable necessity of specialized theoretical and statistical work. suggesting that chasing these grand, sweeping political economy frameworks is actually less valuable than improving the precise tools of our analysis.
That is the core mandate. We have to prioritize what's called real analysis. Analysis that focuses on the underlying facts, on production processes, on industrial behavior, on the specific micromechanisms of adjustment. This is contrasted with a historical tendency in what was called monetary analysis, which often fell victim to popular fallacies because it got disconnected from the ground-level reality of industry.
So the ultimate rigor is about avoiding these simplistic, pre-analytical explanations for massive events like a financial crisis.
Absolutely. The critique against just saying a crisis is caused by producing too much overall is so important because even though it's a negative statement, it's telling you what the crisis isn't, it marks that crucial point where serious, specialized analysis separates itself from mere pre-analytical thought. We have to understand the underlying specific and relative failures in the structure of production, not just blame the outcome by saying there was too much stuff in general.
This deep dive has really taken apart that abstract ideal of the circular flow that we established in episode 1. We've introduced the structural realities that make it completely unattainable. We started by analyzing the profound complexities that come just from pricing, the triad of distribution, and we saw how the entrepreneur had to be reduced to this non-income earning formality just to keep the model's math intact.
We did. And then we watched that whole theoretical possibility of equilibrium just collapse under the crushing weight of friction and time lags. We saw how unsuitable the instantaneous atonement process is for governing real production decisions, which are always burdened by contracts, by sunk costs, and by those unavoidable time delays.
And finally, of course, the introduction of imperfect competition delivered the ultimate blow. It destroyed the mathematical determinacy that the system needs to even calculate its own resting point. The mere existence of market power fundamentally shifts how firms behave. They move from passive adjustment to active strategic maneuvering, which leads to inefficient outcomes like excess capacity.
So those three structural realities, the complexity of distribution, friction, and market power, they demonstrate conclusively why that smooth, static, circular flow from episode 1 is, as we said at the start, impossible to achieve in the real world.
But our static model doesn't just fail because it can't account for reality's rigidities and its complexities. It fails on an even more fundamental level because it ignores the central driver of all economic evolution.
The change itself. The elegant, intricate system we analyze today is designed to be stationary, to be at rest. Yet the real economy is anything but stationary. It's driven by these bursts of energy, of creation and destruction that originate completely outside that simple, repetitive flow of goods and services we've been talking about.
In our next episode, episode 3, we leave the world of static limitations and introduce the ultimate force that drives evolution: the entrepreneur, innovation, and the creation of credit from chapter 3.